So to begin with, the Center for Criminology and Justice is anchoring the Indian Society for Criminology, which is so we have a Mumbai branch, and the center is anchoring the Mumbai branch. And as a part of this, we have organized this book talk, by Professor Jinee Lokaneeta. We'll be giving you her details in a moment. Before that, let me tell you about the Center for Criminology and Justice. We are a part of the School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and we began initially with the objective of creating trained personnel in the field of correctional and criminal justice administration, and later on broadened our focus from corrections to include access to justice, social inclusion, and re-entry of marginalized groups. And we offer courses of postgraduate specialized class instructions and practical training in important areas of criminology, victimology, juvenile justice, criminal law and policy, human rights, social inclusion. And the list can go on, because the area of social work, and when we talk of justice, it's a very broad-based field. And since last year, we have, through our center, been anchoring the ISC, which is the Indian Society of Criminology. Although this is a very old body, and it was established in 1970. And it was again set up with the objective of advancing the study and application of criminology and allied sciences for the welfare of society, and facilitating cooperation among persons and institutions, so that we can promote and spread more awareness about this field of criminology. And we are also it's also in a very short period into a pioneering national organization due to the efforts of dedicated founders. Last year we had a session by Justice Tipsey, and today we are having a book review of Professor Jinee. And I request Professor Ruchi to kindly introduce Professor Jinee.
How do you introduce a person who's so passionate about justice, about the ethos of violence, the stress that violence is increasing everywhere, and we're not doing enough to address it? Going through your curriculum vitae, Jinee, it's been, you can just see that whole passion that you have, that we have to do something about what is happening around. And your education has been around around political science. You've been an alumnus of Kirorimal Delhi University. You went on to do your MA in political science also from Delhi University, and a very interesting topic on Marxist approach to women's question and some early debates. So I see another reason why we should be quickly connecting soon after this talk. You also did your MPhil on women and work, and that is an area that we in TIS are very, very passionate about it. And then you repeated your MA and PhD from the University of Southern California. And I see that entire ethos of political science in your book, and which has been lucidly woven in throughout. You joined Drew University in 2006. And currently you head the department there. You are the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations. Along with that, you're also balancing certain other responsibilities, but you have been the president of the Consortium for Undergraduate Law and Justice Programs. You were also with our National Law University in Delhi. Are you still with them? 2023. Yes. Okay, so you happen to be there. So we've got you for a few hours, precious hours to work to us. You've been writing very, very passionately and prolifically on various issues. The most recent being the book that we're going to be talking about, and we're very excited that we've got you to talk about it, because there's so many nuances, there's so many shades of violence and criminal justice that you have elucidated, which everyone seems to know, but nobody seems to be talking about. So you've aptly captured that in your book. So we look forward to today's session. You've also written on transnational torture, law and violence and state power in the United States and India. I find that very interesting because, they're two different countries who apparently are equally dedicated to justice, equity, human rights, and yet there's so much more to do. I'm not going to be reading about the various writings that you have. Anyone who just kind of Googles you down can get it. And I hope they get to read what you have written, because today's book is a culmination of all that you have done over the years. And it's a great pleasure that you've been with us. Thank you for accepting it. And before we don't waste any more time, we hand it over back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this, very generous introduction. And so I want to just start by thanking Dr. Ruchi Sinha and Dr. Asha Mukundan and Dr. Vijay Raghavan and others who are here, who've invited me. The Center for Criminology and Justice and Indian Society of Criminology, the Mumbai chapter. I feel, as I was saying earlier, more informally, that it's particularly special to be invited by TIS, since I have really wonderful memories when I did my field research in Mumbai for my book, and also had the pleasure of speaking at a class that Dr. Vijay Raghavan had during that time. So I'm happy to, sort of connect again and hope to visit in person at some point as well. So I'll share my screen. I hope I'm enabled. Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm assuming everybody can see it. Yeah. And there I go. All right. So in August 2021, the current Chief Justice of the Indian Supreme Court said in a very important effort to ensure a right to legal aid, and I quote, "The threat to human rights and bodily integrity are the highest in police stations. In spite of constitutional declarations and guarantees, lack of effective legal representation at the police stations is a huge detriment to arrested, detained persons. To keep police excesses in check, dissemination of information about the constitutional right to legal aid and availability of free legal aid services is necessary," end quote. And undoubtedly, the problem of custodial torture and deaths has been a prevalent one all through post-independent India and in colonial India as well. As I will argue today, custodial torture cannot just be addressed by focusing on the police or noting colonial continuities, since the primary statutes governing Indian criminal justice system, including the Police Act, continue from British colonial time. Nor is it just a question of ensuring rights such as legal aid, although all these are important to consider. Rather, as I point out in my recent book, The Truth Machines, the Indian Supreme Court's inadequate jurisprudence, the role of actors, including and beyond the police, to magistrates and even to semi-state actors such as forensic psychologists and medical professionals, and indeed the entire state development model of modernization may be important to consider to understand torture, or as my broader theoretical framing indicates, the relationship between legal violence and state power in liberal democracies. And I'm going to talk about this. I put forward the concept of the contingent state to conceptualize this relationship. Now, my research focus has generally been on the relationship between law, violence, and state power in liberal democracies. In my first book, Transnational Torture, focusing on India and US, I traced how jurisprudence that is considered the most legitimate state discourse formally condemns torture, yet ends up accommodating excess violence. In that work, I primarily focused on analyzing legal cases from both India and the United States in the post-9/11 context. I also analyzed reports and cultural representations of torture in TV shows like 24 to intervene in a debate on whether torture was an exception in liberal democracies, and argued that excess violence was very much a part of the governing in liberal democracies. In the truth machines, then I shifted from jurisprudence to also examine more closely state actors who are responsible for interpreting and implementing the laws and safeguards against torture. Let me start with just a very brief overview of what the Indian state's problem with custodial torture is in terms of numbers. Now, we don't have statistics on number of torture cases in India, though we have numerous reports. But we do have numbers on custodial deaths. The annual report on torture brought out by the National Campaign Against Torture noted that between April 1, 2019 to March 31st, 2020, about 113 people died in police custody and 1569 in judicial custody, as noted by the Ministry of Home Affairs. The group notes in its 2021 report that there were 111 deaths in 2020 alone. Thus, custodial deaths in India continued despite the strict lockdown during the pandemic. Torture in India is prevalent in distinct contexts. As human rights scholar, activist Gautam Navlakha, currently in Taloja jail, had once helped me systematically understand in an interview. I present in my attempt to think of the numerous sites by extending the metaphor of the torture tree that Lawrence Ralph has utilized in his path-breaking work on torture against Blacks and other minorities in Chicago, US, in his book Torture Letters. Torture tree for Ralph refers to the trunk representing mistreatment, harassment, torture, and death from the system of law and order that disproportionately impacts Blacks as compared to whites in the US. The branches are really the police and military who commit those acts, and the leaves are the everyday acts of police, while the roots are an investment in fear in maintaining what is called the racial caste system. Taking some liberty in modifying it in the Indian context, I would say that understanding the torture tree would help us reveal the different sites and hierarchies to be maintained. In India, in routine cases, it is evident in the numerous custodial deaths that continue to occur even in theft or dispute cases. Think, for instance, the new Tamil film Jai Bhim, where Raj Kannu and his relatives from Irula tribe were brutally tortured in custody in a false case of theft. The case is really about how tribal, caste, class, and gender identities and assumption of habitual offenders form the experience with police. Second is the context of terrorism and organized crime cases facilitated by extraordinary laws. Terrorism and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, Prevention of Terrorism Act, Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act earlier, and now Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Now, these laws evade routine safeguards against extended detention and delay in bail. Third, in context of Kashmir, parts of the Northeast, and Punjab previously, torture, detention, and disappearances are common because those who commit these crimes have virtual impunity, even as habeas petitions are denied. One can now start adding a fourth category, which doesn't neatly fit, that of targeting human rights activists and of foreclosing dissent. The refusal to give bail to vulnerable prisoners despite an inability to avoid overcrowding during a pandemic, or putting them in an anda cell, egg-shaped cell to punish them, or to just use detention as punishment against dissenters, as denial of bail for activists can be seen, also make these conditions inhuman and torturous. In all these contexts, victims of torture and custodial deaths are often from poorer and marginalized groups, including tribal, Dalit, women, transgender, and minorities, particularly Muslims, and as I noted earlier, those who dissent, though it could be extended to others. To recall just two shocking incidents more recently, in June 2021, Mariamma, a 40-year-old Dalit woman, her son and son's friend were arrested in an alleged theft case, subjected to torture, and Mariamma died in the hospital. On November 8, 2021, there was a custodial death of a Muslim youth, Altaf, and the shocking video of a police officer claiming that Altaf committed suicide in custody in Kasganj, UP, by using a string of a jacket to hang himself on a 2.5 feet water pipe. Despite numerous fact-finding reports by People's Union for Democratic Rights and others about custodial torture and deaths, the category of illness and suicides dominate the official explanation of custodial deaths. As you can see in this chart, I put together from National Crimes Research Bureau data, and that helped elide the relationship of torture and custodial deaths. If these are the contexts in which torture exists, the puzzle in my book, The Truth Machines, that I started off with, is why in a context where torture exists with such impunity and officials rarely convicted or charged, partly because of an absence of a specific law against torture and non-ratification of the UN Convention Against Torture, a discourse on truth machines to replace physical torture appeared. And how does it help understand the relationship between state power and legal violence in liberal democracies? In addition to focusing on legal cases, reports, political discourses, and popular representations, I conducted interviews with police, forensic psychologists, lawyers, and activists in 5 cities, Delhi, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Bangalore, and Gandhinagar, visiting forensic science labs in these cities to understand the relationship between law, science, and policing. I focused on the emergence of 3 scientific techniques that I termed truth machines: narcoanalysis, brain scans, and lie detectors. Very briefly, narcoanalysis is the injecting of sodium pentothal for inducing confessions or information, popularly known as the truth serum. The second is brain fingerprinting and its Indian version, brain electrical oscillation signature test that supposedly captures experiential participation in a crime through an electroencephalogram, and lie detectors that measure physiological indicators. My focus is to study and understand the everyday practices of the state, not captured by more monolithic conceptions of the state, whether it's a more Weberian, bureaucratic conception of monopoly over legitimate violence constrained by rules, or a more Agamben-inspired understanding of a sovereign state's violence over bare life. Here, I draw more from the anthropologists of the state, such as Veena Das, Akhil Gupta, and others, and adopt a more ethnographic sensibility. I put forward the idea of a contingent state, which refers to the ways in which states constantly oscillate between the desire to be unitary and an inability to do so under certain conditions. The concept of contingent state points to the constantly negotiated nature of the relationship between state power and legal violence. Let me explain. If we just see the emergence of these techniques, there's an often assumption of clear intentionality in state techniques. So for instance, think of changes in methods of execution, let's say in the US, but also elsewhere, from hanging to lethal injections, or from scarring to non-scarring techniques. But interviews with the Indian police and forensic psychologists suggested the contingent emergence and use of these techniques. The rise of these particular truth machines in India were actually the result of clear contingencies. Ambitious forensic psychologists in forensic science labs in Gandhinagar and Bangalore wanting more visibility legally and in public that led to the popularization of these techniques. At some point, the truth machines also fitted the post-colonial Indian state's desire to to appear as using scientific and modern techniques, in part due to the critique of the human rights movement that was consolidating in the 1980s, 90s. It was primarily after 1975-77, when there was an emergency declared by then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, due to internal disturbances and wide-scale torture and detentions took place during this time, that there was a consolidation of the human rights movement post-emergency to focus on protection of human rights. And one of the major issues that was dealt with was the question of custodial torture and deaths, particularly of political prisoners, but over time on custodial deaths and torture more generally. Groups such as PUDR, People's Union for Civil Liberties, APDR, CPDR, Andhra Pradesh Civil Liberties Committee, and international NGOs like Amnesty focused on these questions. And both due to internal and external pressures, India set up a National Human Rights Commission that focused on custodial deaths. The 1990s also became a period when Supreme Court jurisprudence on torture, like the D.K. Basu case, emerged, which used an expanded notion of due process, using Article 21 of the Indian Constitution to acknowledge the pervasiveness of torture. The court, for instance, created safeguards such as arrest or custody memo to involve the family or public as a witness to the arrest, since illegal detention is fairly common, enabling torture. The court also notes the need for a pre-trial right to a lawyer and regular medical examinations, and has periodically focused on the implementation of these safeguards as well. So when I trace the emergence and consolidation of the techniques, though lie detectors existed earlier, it was only in the 1990s that these techniques collectively emerged. And one of the primary reasons for its ascendance was that there was a claim of these techniques replacing physical torture. As a retired police officer in Bangalore put it, I quote, "When I and others joined the police department, there was no narco analysis, or such things were unheard of. Only third degree and torturing the criminals was the method that was being used, which is not legal. Narco analysis came, human rights came. We had to use very patient methods, very slow detection. Breakthrough took some time," end quote. I suggest that it is in the 1990s, 2000s that the aspirations of individual forensic psychologists seem to merge with the need of the post-colonial state to use science and expertise to find technical solutions for police torture. In some ways, it's similar to what Timothy Mitchell calls the technopolitics in the context of Egypt, an alloy of non-human and human, or what I called an attempt on the part of the forensic psychologists as a combination of scientific machines and use of therapeutic art to be distinguished from the quote-unquote brutal police. The ills of the Indian criminal justice system were to be addressed by the developmentalist state to create a state forensic architecture with machine and experts, with no regard for reliability or validity of these techniques for legal purposes or their coercive aspects. Thus, the state's modernization paradigm welcomed these techniques as crucial for police reform. In fact, the state high courts in mid-2000s that considered the constitutionality of these techniques basically upheld the techniques as replacing physical torture by involving medics and as a natural extension of the investigation. Considered safe as they represented modernization similar to other life-saving machines. In the state of Andhra Pradesh versus Srimati Inapura Padma and others, for instance, the court notes, in the accusations made in India, the police are attributed with applying third-degree methods in eliciting information. And there are instances of the culprits or suspects dying in lockups during the course of interrogation, on account of application of third-degree methods. Therefore, there's a blame that the Indian police are flagrantly violating the human rights. Therefore, there is every need to apply scientific tests to elicit the information from the culprits, end quote. The truth machines were only available in very few labs, though my interviews revealed that there was initially a plan to build a huge network of these truth machines, even at the district levels, with mobile forensic science labs, and was a developmental priority for the Indian state. The Supreme Court, even when it intervened, while unequivocally ruling out the involuntary use of the techniques, focused mostly on consent and inadmissibility of evidence as a result of these techniques, though allowed for exception in terms of admissibility. In the process, even the highest court doesn't question the paradigm itself of using questionable science, of allowing medical professionals who had played an uneven role against torture in the past, and does not completely challenge conditions of police custody or remand, which often is seen as synonymous with torture. In the Indian context, the truth machines, of course, did not actually replace physical torture because they got used in very few cases, are themselves coercive, and they often got used alongside physical torture for terrorism-related cases in order to get particular answers. Let me explain this with the help of the Mumbai blast case. On July 11, 2006, 7 bombings occurred on local trains in Mumbai. 189 people were killed and over 800 injured. Once the anti-terrorism squad Mumbai took over, 13 Muslim men were charged with the crime, having been charged under the Indian Penal Code, as well as under 2 extraordinary laws, the 1967 Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and the MACOCA. And in 2015, 12 of them were convicted and 1 acquitted. All the accused were reportedly tortured and 12 of them confessed. Methods of torture included electric shocks and beatings with a flour mill belt. As one recounted, the police started beating me by flour mill belt and sticks on my palm and soles. I was tied by rope and given electric shock to my private parts. End quote. Other methods in the Indian context included stripping men naked, putting them in stress positions, beating the palms of their hands and feet, and forcing them to sit with their feet at 180 degrees. One detainee mentioned the injecting of liquid chemicals through the anus. A torture room of the anti-terrorism squad figures in these narratives. Other methods of instilling fear were threats of torture, detention, and extrajudicial killing, together with the targeting of family members, including the threat of rape for women. Family members might be brought to the station to be harassed and insulted, and occasionally also subjected to stripping and beating. Narco-analysis played a prominent role in the Mumbai blast case and draws our attention to what I call the semi-state actors. The concept of contingent state I propose in the book, as opposed to a unitary or exceptional state, helps us think about the role of other actors involved in policing, namely the forensic psychologists who claim that they are different from the police, and provide therapy as an extension of the machine. As one psychologist said, and I quote, "While torture is an external stimuli, these techniques are internal ones and invite an internal journey. They force you to review your past in a different way, not confess, but ask them to think about themselves and come back. It is a moment of catharsis in the legal system. Unlike the police custody, where there's a fear of encounter or custodial death or torture, here there is empathy," end quote. In the Mumbai blast case of 2006, Abdul Wahid Sheikh, only one acquitted, and author of an incredibly stringent critique of the Indian criminal justice system, Beguna Kaidi, which has now been translated into English from Hindi and Urdu, also initially believed that the truth machines conducted by the doctors would reveal the truth about his innocence, until he realized that it wasn't to be. The psychologists even claimed that the techniques won't actually work if the persons are physically or psychologically harmed, gesturing to a shift in the mode of interrogations. But then, of course, they end up creating some of the same conditions in labs and hospitals by utilizing these coercive machines to get confessions involuntarily, and therefore need to be squarely rejected. Yet the management of this violence and the actors beyond the police are important to recognize in their disaggregated and multifaceted form. So why were the truth machines a problem, especially narcoanalysis? Medical ethics scholar and activist Amar Jasani characterizes narcoanalysis as a form of pharmacological torture. Torture, in fact, remains torture even if it does not spill blood, break bones, and is done in sterile, air-conditioned operation theaters, end quote. Similarly, a human rights group noted, narcoanalysis negates protections by making redundant the right to silence of the subject. And this is even ignoring the fact that there's no scientific reliability and validity for these tests for legal purposes. The possibilities of manipulation in narcoanalysis were tremendous. In the Mumbai blast case, the accused insisted that they were forcibly asked to consent to narcoanalysis. Consent in custody thus becomes a charged concept, as one account demonstrates. Dr. Malini, this is a quote, Dr. Malini misbehaved and slapped me twice before the test. They asked me to say some things before a video camera and beat me before asking me to say the sentences. She threatened that if I do not give correct answers, she would give me AIDS injection. I became semi-conscious after the injection of narco test was given. She asked illogical questions to me during this condition. The camera was switched on and first she asked how many bombs were prepared. I answered that I was not concerned and I'm falsely involved. She slapped me strongly and started pinching my left ear with pliers, because of which I suffered much. She then asked me what comes after 6 and I answered 7. She asked me on what TV operates and I answered that it operates on electricity. She again slapped me strongly and caught my ear with pliers and told me to say, by remote. She asked me many such illogical questions and used to ask me to repeat the answers if I did not give the expected answers. Both tortured me badly during the narco test, end quote. This instance appears to violate even the self-proclaimed standards for narcoanalysis by state officials to be conducted, quote unquote, safely in a hospital or forensic laboratory. Pliers were reportedly used during the procedure, illogical questions were asked, and specified answers demanded. Each test concluded with an interrogator's insistence for a signature on a tailored confession. The depositions in this case thus undermine any claim to replacing torture with narcoanalysis and police with forensic psychologists, and how merely ensuring consent may not mean much. The simultaneity of torture and truth machines is important here. Torture leads to a confession that must be recreated through a non-physical scientific technique. CDs from narcoanalysis sessions was edited to suit the police narrative. As a lawyer described the account of one of the accused, they played the CD of the narco test to me, and I was shocked to see that in place of my reply to the question as to how many bombs were prepared, the reply was 7. Anyone could see that the CD was edited because the words were not in sync with the video, end quote. As Sheikh warns, suspects should never answer in the negative because their responses could be manipulated to appear as if they are answering other questions. The video camera thus becomes a means for generating public confessions. So when one thinks of the link between these truth machines to torture, it is not just that the techniques are coercive, but also in the fact that they were used to legitimize a shift in physical torture as a way for a democracy to show its commitment to rule of law of dealing with torture, even as it was never replaced, and merely created another site for extraction of confession, this time with the help of science and experts, which fits the modernizing narrative, the civilizational discourse that all liberal states claim and post-colonial states in particular strive for. The notion of the contingent state thus helps us understand both the experience of those impacted by the violence, but also the points of intersections with the police accounts in terms of what creates a possibility of resistance or break from within the state violence. Sheikh, for instance, reveals what the police are constrained by, a dead body in custody. I quote, लेकिन याद रखिए पुलिस आपको टॉर्चर से मार नहीं डालेगी, वो तो केवल इतना मारेगी कि आप डर कर उसका काम कर दें, वो इस तरह नहीं मारेगी जिससे गहरे जख्म हो, इसलिए पूरी कोशिश करें कि कैमरा के सामने कोई बयान न दें. End quote. But you should remember that the police will not kill you with the torture. They will only beat you to the extent that you agree to do their work. The police won't beat you in such a way that there are physical wounds. So try your best not to give a statement in front of the camera. This sentiment is echoed by a police officer in a training academy who connected the human rights movement, the National Human Rights Commission reports, and the D.K. Basu case. These, he believed, collectively made the police much more nervous about deaths in custody. I quote, the suspect's safety is in your custody. You don't want him to die. So you take care of him, your brother. You're scared of death, end quote. Often the Indian police is understood mostly as either a colonial continuity, as Deena Heath and Radha Kumar historians have more recently shown, or inspired by the more Marxist or critical conceptions. Police are seen as repressive institutions of the state, implying that they do not require much scrutiny. But these insights are less revealed in my interviews. In this limited sense, drawing from new police studies scholars, I term it the pastoral role of the police mediating the coercive. I point to how studying the police as a site of state power in the everyday sense allows for an access into the structural constraints that the police themselves face, but above all reveals in their own words the pragmatic logic of why third degree continues. It is the fear of the custodial death that has allowed for the mediation of the coercive with the pastoral. The emergence of these truth machines thus helps one understand the vacillations of the contingent state and whether there are shifts and cracks possible in both the narratives and practices of the state that have life and death consequences for those who experience state violence. Here, I also want to note the role of the magistrates and doctors in the case required by law to ensure protections against torture. The magistrates in front of whom these men were produced rarely inquired into these cases. Before each hearing, the accused were threatened not to reveal their experiences. As one detainee noted, the police threatened that if we complain about beating and torture, they would involve our family members in the case and would torture us more. Therefore, I did not say anything before the judge because of the fear, end quote. If they protested, the accused were tortured again. One had an infected ear from the use of pliers, but he was warned not to complain or the torture would be even more brutal. One detainee described waterboarding. A wet cloth was put on my face, because of which I was not able to breathe. They had an apparatus with them, by which probably they were measuring my blood pressure, and after a certain level was reached, they used to remove the cloth, end quote. Only when he agreed to confess did the torture stop. He was then given some ointments or taken to the hospital, where he was warned not to complain to the doctor. Only occasionally, he recalled, would a magistrate ask for a medical exam. But doctors overlooked his injuries even when they were aware of severe torture. Before a court hearing, suspects might be allowed to sleep so that they didn't appear tortured in front of the magistrate. As one accused explained, I was taken for a medical checkup many times during police custody, but was not physically checked by the doctors, not allowed to speak with the doctors. The veil was not removed at any time, but only my thumb impressions were taken, end quote. After his brother was also tortured, another of the accused realized that the panchnamas he was forced to sign involved recovery of admissible evidence. The body must provide oral proof. doctors and magistrates who are by law charged with ensuring the veracity of procedures, thus fail to challenge the forcible extraction. As a lawyer in another terrorism-related case said, so my question is, how come the judiciary, how come these magistrates who remanded these boys without complying with that mandatory requirement of the Supreme Court, how come disciplinary action was not taken against them? End quote. In the absence of action against judges who convict on flimsy evidence or magistrates who fail to follow safeguards against torture, this lawyer noted. Otherwise, what is the message I get as a Muslim? They were able to play football with your life, your career, your human rights, and this, damn all that you can do about it. And what's the message that judges will get? Play whatever games you can, you are immune. End quote. Each step in the procedure must be followed, even as it is substantively undermined. Even under Makoka, used in the Mumbai case, a confession must be voluntary. The Deputy Commissioner of Police must warn the accused without police pressure about the right to silence and then ask to repeat the confession in front of a magistrate who ensures a medical exam outside police custody. All these measures ostensibly ensure that a suspect confess voluntarily and not due to torture or pressure. But in practice, each step becomes little more than a bureaucratic check mark, indicative more of a scaffolding than ensuring the rights of the accused. Rather than revealing the violence, the state and semi-state actors mask the violence through these bureaucratic check marks. The procedures are technically followed, thereby preserving what I term the scaffold of the rule of law, and end up invisibilizing the state violence. Ultimately, the scaffolding keeps these elements of the system in place, providing a facet of a rational bureaucratic system. For Michel Foucault, who writes of the spectacle of the scaffold through public execution and torture confirmed the truth of the crime in public. The scaffold of the rule of law, however, ensures the truth of the crime in public through procedures meant to avoid the theatrical production of torture by masking it. Thus, when the definition of the rule of law primarily focuses on formal procedural safeguards and judiciary's role in protecting individual rights, the violence within is hidden. The detainee narratives thus help reveal the violence and also challenge those who keep it in place. When we focus just on the police, we fail to notice how the scaffold of the rule of law is created collectively by police, magistrates, and doctors or forensic psychologists. And it is this realization of the role of other state and semi-state actors in protecting someone in custody that has led to my current project, and I'll talk very briefly about that. Article 22 of the Indian Constitution states, every person who is arrested and detained in custody shall be produced before the nearest magistrate within a period of 24 hours of such arrest, excluding the time necessary for the journey from the place of arrest to the court of the magistrate. The focus of my new project is on the temporalities of justice represented by the custodial safeguards, the moment a person steps into the police custody and the limits therein. Rather than considering justice as being the end point of a process of investigation or after the person has been the subject of custodial violence, it examines the first point of interaction between the state and the citizen in custody. I argue that the right to citizenship in a liberal democracy must directly focus on ensuring human life and dignity in custody, especially in the first few hours of custody, an issue that is inadequately addressed by scholarships and courts and movements alike. The very condition of custody means that the experience of time is transformed by the detainee. Through the study of primary materials and an ethnographic study of judicial magistrate courts in 2 cities alongside interviews, I focus on the need to rethink citizenship and justice for custodial violence. Temporal injustices are visible in that Particular sections of society make up the bulk of the prison population in India and may face state violence disproportionately. Since custodial violence disproportionately impacts the marginalized, the emphasis will be on capturing the subjective positions, experience, and resistance of Dalit, Muslims, women, and other marginal figures from the custodial space where they are most dehumanized and attempt to be erased. The significance of this project is reflected in the fact that the National Crimes Research Bureau's Crimes in India data collated by CHRI suggests that almost 63% of custodial deaths between 2010 to 2020 took place before the person was produced in front of the magistrate. Thus, the stage of detention in police custody is an exceedingly important side, but inadequately focused aspect of studies of custodial violence. In conclusion, my work focuses specifically on the constantly negotiated relationship between state power and legal violence as central to our study of police and state. And the notion of a contingent state thus accounts for the need to study the distinct sites, actors, mechanisms, and experiences of and resistance to state violence to note the shifts, cracks, and possibilities of transformation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jinee. That was just a completely lucid take on your own book. And every time you read the book again or you hear about it again, a new facet just sticks to your imagination. And your last line, that slipping through the cracks, is something that we, especially the criminal justice social workers who are a part of this forum, we are particularly concerned about. And we've been talking about, we've been engaging about, and been absolutely foxed how to deal with it. Because as you said in your talk, that there are structural constraints within the police. And what makes it very difficult to deal with is that they're aware of the structural constraints, they're aware of what they should not be doing, they try not to do it many a times, and yet land up doing it. So how do you negotiate that difficult space is something that we are really, really struggling with. And it's not only at the police station, it's at at the legal aid services, it's at the prisons, and it's even at rehabilitation. So when they are undergoing correctional services, and it's not only in the adult system, it's also in the juvenile justice system. So how do you propose, how do you even fathom that, where do we begin?
Do you want me to respond to that?
Yes, we'll take 2-3 questions and then we'll take it from the participants.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very difficult question, right? And I will say that there are multiple things or multiple levels at which some of these conversations have to take place, right? And one of my biggest sort of concerns has been, right, whether we still have adequate focus on the police and prison and criminal justice system. And what I mean by that is not to undermine the kind of amazing work, that particularly sociologists, criminologists, and, the center, the people at the center and so on, right, have done over the years. But just in terms of, thinking about, for instance, my own, discipline and sort of related questions, is to basically think about how, there's so much focus on the conceptions of rule of law or democracy or citizenship, but those are never linked to what is happening at the level of the police or prison system, right? And and for me also, because I'm located in the US, right? One of the things that always strikes me is how there has always been, since the 1970s, right, a very stark critical scholarship that has focused on prisons and police, right? And that was available when, you had sort of the kind of Black Lives Matter movement that came up, a few years ago, and then in George Floyd's case and Breonna Taylor's case last year, which reminds you that it's only when the mainstream consciousness, right, when it becomes a part of the mainstream consciousness about what's happening in police and prisons, that you can actually think about, actual change, right? And so in some ways, we saw a little bit of a reaction when the Jairaj Benix case happened in Tamil Nadu, right? But it was also striking how rare that is, right? That it becomes sort of a moment of debate, in the Indian context. So I think, I want to both say that there are specific sites that need to be very closely looked at when we are thinking about proposals for change, right? And I think to some extent we've always had that, and I can specifically talk about, okay, what would police reforms look like, or interrogation techniques look like, but it is striking to me that it never becomes something that is the subject of discussion when we are thinking about what defines a democracy or a rule of law, or a the questions of citizenship and dignity. So I also want us to sort of ask that question: what is it that can lead to such changes? Because what that doesn't do is then allow for the scrutiny of the kind that now we are beginning to see in multiple sites.
Thank you. Yes, I do agree that there's a whole lot of looking within ourselves also, that whether we are asking the right questions and whether we are taking it to the larger forum. That's very, very important. And maybe more than taking it to the larger forum, sustaining it within that forum and ensuring that the disconcerting issues that are there with what we have experienced does not die down. So then, Jinee, the next question, what I'm going to do is there are some questions and there's some my questions. I'm going to kind of combine them. There are three participants who said that, which is linked to my next question, is that scaffolding of the law is something that is more of an impediment to justice rather than helping in justice. So do you suggest that we undo that scaffolding and begin right from the start?
Yeah, I mean, so let me just go back and maybe unpack that a little bit, right? So one of the big interventions when we are thinking about custodial violence is actually the kind of protections that exist. And so I do think that the role of the magistrate, the role of the medical examiners or the doctors, and ensuring sort of legal aid right at the moment of custody, right? I mean, you see that that is a huge, I mean, if the Chief Justice of India is sort of, in 2021, sort of saying that legal aid needs to be ensured, in order to prevent third degree, you can also see that there's an acknowledgement that, these rights are not available, right? So I think those procedural aspects are extremely important, right? But a lot of the time, what happens is that a lot of energy goes in both articulating the formal procedural safeguards, right? DK Basu and all the following jurisprudences kind of doing that. But what it doesn't do is basically recognize that just having those formal procedural safeguards are not going to make a difference, right? And just to say, I talked about the terrorism related cases, but you can think about Jairaj and Benix. Jairaj and Benix actually were taken in front of a magistrate, right? But the magistrate was, I think, up in the balcony and basically looked at them, and they were taken to doctors who apparently did not report on the fact that they were bleeding profusely, right? So if you look at it, then the procedural safeguards under the rule of law was being followed, right? But it did not save them. They ultimately died, right? So the idea of the scaffold is to remind one that basically just because you see the semblance of the procedural safeguards doesn't mean that they are substantively being protective, which does not mean that we do not need those safeguards, right? I think those are really very, very important to ensure, but we have to make sure that there is a recognition of the importance of those, right? So for instance, when I think about my newer project, right, it's oftentimes this hearing in front of the magistrate just becomes a bureaucratic formality, right? But if we sort of think about the fact that this is actually written in the Constitution, right? So it's a constitutional safeguard, and this is the first time that a person engages with a constitutional safeguard, really, right? So why is it that there isn't much, right, focus on that as a form of justice? So I'm also very interested in making sure that each aspect of the interaction between the person and the state becomes the subject of our critical analysis and focus, not just of those who are civil liberty activists and the lawyers who are mandated by law and so on, right? But really saying that that is where life and death is being determined for many in the Indian criminal justice system. So that's the kind of shift that I'm talking about when I'm saying that the scaffold needs to be examined as well as reimagined, right? And the more we examine it, the more we reimagine it, right? We would see those possibilities of shifts and change, one hopes.
One really hopes, and we really hope that the change comes quick. The next question I'm going to jump to, because there are a few questions and also Vijay's asked, that often we have seen...
Ruchi, can I come in?
Yes,
Can I come in for a while?
Sure, ma'am.
Okay, now, with my background experience of interacting with all the members of the criminal justice system, very insightful, comprehensive speech she has given. But what I want to go to the ground reality. For the decades, I've been interacting with the judiciary, police, and the correction. And I tried my utmost to bring about a coordination where the coordination lacks between the police, the judiciary, and the correction. The police psyche says that if there is a crime rise in my vicinity, I'm transferred. The police psyche says that if I do not make a person confess, knowing fully well that he has a background of criminality, that another crime will take place, and then I will again be questioned by my seniors. Mm-hmm. So, there is a sort of phobia in the police psyche. As a result, they take the support of torture. I accept it. Another thing I want to share with you, and this is ground reality I'm telling you. The police says that when we produce an accused in the court, the police personnel is not asked to sit. He remains standing even in the presence of the magistrate. And then he's looked with suspicion, as if you have concocted the case or you have coerced the person. So many a times, these are the facts which have come out in the class itself. When the police said that we produce evidences, we were told that you have coerced the person to give these evidences. And in a lot of our efforts to bring the person to book, the person is left cost-free. Next, what happens? that policeman is threatened, his family is threatened by the accused and the accused party if he belongs to a gang, a very prominent gang. His life is insecure. So this is what I'm trying to convey, the psyche of the police. Why is it that police goes into torture? Now come to the judiciary. Judiciary, I always question them. When I used to ask the district magistrate, the district judges, why don't you take these people's words in toto? They said no, because they have tortured, they have coerced, there's custodial torture, custodial deaths. So that is how the police is eyed by the judiciary. This is happening in our country. Now, you know what? I am looking with hope on certain things. Let me convey this. One is, with this present version of our Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, saying that now with the new crimes coming out with new technology, you have to have forensic science in the midst, in the forefront. That was not there, even when I was doing, because I know polygraph was used. Narco analysis cannot be used with the consent of the judiciary. Even in the polygraph, the questions that were asked, they used to be so stereotyped. Yes or no? They were not, humanitarian grounds. They were not modulated. They were not modified because the forensic scientists were not trained to that extent. And I have one point more to say before I continue. That where do the forensic scientists, with whom do they accompany? You look at FBI, you look at CIA, you see the conviction rates are high there because the forensic scientists, including psychologists, sociologists, many others, doctors, they accompany. The team goes into the crime investigation, collects the evidences and the circumstantial evidences. So there's no to it. But here, when CBI, any case is given to CBI, then the forensic scientists are going there. What about the local crimes? What about the crimes occurring in the state? All crimes are not going to CBI. My contention is that even if a crime may be of any magnitude happens, the forensic scientists should be there to collect the evidences, to study the criminal, to study the background of the criminal, and then bring forth. And I think here, my appeal to the judiciary is at least trust the forensic scientists. Once again, as Madam said, Jinee said, that even when the forensic scientists are bringing out the reports, the narratives are being tampered by the police. Now here, something has to be done. Should we take them as independent departments, or should we take the forensic scientists under the police department? Because then again, there will be a question mark. So these things have to be looked into. Whatever she has said is a very insightful, Ruchi. But with my experience of, trying my level best, I became slightly pessimistic. Because the police said, here we are. At any time we are asked to go.
Yes, ma'am. I think everyone who's worked on the ground and has been doing training with the professionals, we see that there's a ground reality and then there is a practice, and both of them are very difficult to negotiate. So I think, ma'am, if you may allow, so Jinee, the next question is related to a whole lot of things that ma'am Sanyal has raised, is that the presence, or rather the absence of various disciplines in the judiciary system or the justice system in India. So the kind of justice that we are looking or aspiring for needs to match up with the different social realities that our justice system is dealing with. So beginning from the police to prevent it from becoming pastoral and repressive, could we have professionals as the gatekeepers? Then we allow the police to do whatever they're doing, let the forensic experts do something, but we bolstered all the justice professionals with a high level of ethical constitutional values. And they are protected that if they do something in the name of justice, going against the power holders, they will not face the music. Is it possible, Jinee? And with the multiple disciplines?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those insightful comments as well. I mean, I will always say that, in some ways, my focus has primarily been on one site, right, which is really the site of thinking about custodial deaths and torture in the context of interrogations, right? But of course, when we think about state violence, it's all or sort of the um, sort of the scope is much wider, right? And I would say that at the very beginning, that each of these particular aspects needs their own conversation and specific solutions, right? For instance, just to sort of reiterate that the power of doing very detailed you know, sort of criminal justice related empirical studies is clearly seen from the kind of work that is being done by people in the center, right? As well as sort of, I think of journalists who are really, in the wire, for instance, they brought out something on how caste segregated work was still in Rajasthan prisons. Sukanya Shanta, for instance, has done that. Or there's the Criminal Justice and Accountability Project in Bhopal, right? And they have done incredibly detailed work, sort of thinking about policing in a pandemic. Now, all this to say that one needs very, very specific kind of focus on different aspects of policing and the criminal justice system, right? So it is very difficult to, in some ways, generalize about that. That said, I will say, maybe three things in response to, some of what has come up. One, I mean, I think I am very, very, conscious of the kind of constraints, right, that police can also be faced with, right? So one of the things that I do in the book is also have interviews with the police and sort of, think about, what is it that, how do they explain their own situation, right? And in some ways, I would just say that, the issue, of course, is that the question of accountability for police abuse and violence and human rights violations, has not been as stringent that we can only look at the constraints that the police face, right? So somewhere or the other, questions of police autonomy, right? Police resources, forensic science resources, I mean, that all is extremely important, right? So we cannot actually have these conversations without taking them into account. But what happens is often is that the constraints become the way of saying that accountability is not that important. And I'm very conscious about the fact that we should not pit them against each other, right? Because the reasons for their lack of accountability is not just because they don't have resources, right? And I think that is important to acknowledge. But I will say, for instance, just to give you one example, that in other parts of the world, DNA or other kinds of forensic science techniques, with all their limits, is often used, right? And forensic psychologists in India often would say that, but crime scenes are not protected enough that we can actually collect the evidence. So I'm very aware of some of those challenges, right? But then it really surprises me that in the middle of the pandemic, for instance, the Delhi High Court wanted the Delhi government to actually start a narco analysis facility in Delhi. And I'm thinking about why is that a priority, And so the worry in sort of talking about particularly these forensic techniques is whether you end up emphasizing confessions, right? That confessions at any cost cannot be the basis of policing and a criminal justice system to work. And that is my concern, right? Anything that takes us away and basically think about, okay, what are the resources or the training or the forensic science techniques that globally are being used? Can they be a part of the modern police, professionalizing, is something that I think is very important, right? But the issue, the reason why, the story needed to be told is that a lot of the times it's all geared towards trying to get confession at any cost. And, and I think that for any system in the world, it is not a very useful thing. One other thing about, thinking about political science and, sort of criminal justice scholars and activists or researchers working together. I mean, I think for me, I am, like, as you will see, I am very concerned that while I think I see a lot more work in American political science and sort of, in different parts of the world, there's a lot more focus on policing, right? In the context of India, we now have a handful of scholars in the last few years who have really talked about police and police violence, and and in fact, I'm with a couple of scholars trying to bring together some scholarship on that. But it still has not become a central point of analysis, I think, for political science, right? And which really is a big lacuna and a limit, I would say, and which then makes it very difficult to work together, right? But my hope is that aspects of it, right? I think sociology has done a better job, right? In some ways, sort of really, thinking about prisons in particular and criminal justice more broadly. But I do think that more and more, as we see that each sort of movement that takes place and very soon faces, a kind of a pushback in terms of, from the police or from the state, does have a tendency to then bring state violence to the fore of our consciousness. I also think that even though the judiciary hasn't been amazing in terms of dealing with overcrowding in prisons during pandemic, it has varied a lot across states. And of course, you all know more about this. It has, in a strange sort of way, brought focus on prison conditions in ways that we haven't seen before, right? Much more in the mainstream context. I also think that global debates have a way of, sort of reflecting, right, the concerns. So while I'm not entirely sure whether, different disciplines, there are many possibilities of different disciplines to come together. But I'm not entirely sure. I do feel that I'm hopeful by this sentence that Michelle Alexander in the US context has said, that it's only when grassroots organizing and critical academic scholarship come together, right, that you can actually see a lot more shifting in societies. And I do think that a conversation like ours is also a little small point of some of these beginnings as well.
Your last line was like music to my ears, grassroots organizing and scholarships. Because frankly, Jinee, I mean, when it came to the situation of prisons and pandemic, our field action project Prayas, it actually went to the court and brought it out, and it led to a very good outcome. And our another field action project, Resource Cell for Juvenile Justice, highlighted the conditions of children in institutions. Right. So it was we actually feel that we are in between the grassroots and the academics, and the pressure is very high, but the hope is that one day we'll bring about change. And that I link to the second last question that the same participant has asked. One is the pessimism around the failure of constitutional safeguards, and you've partly answered that already. But do you have any suggestions to, probably strengthen it? And the second is that if confessions have to be declared unconstitutional, will practices like plea bargaining, sentence commuting, etc., work? What are your views on that?
So I will say that, constitutional safeguards are sort of this, you can't do without them, right? But then you're always sort of struggling with the inadequacy of them in practice, right? So I think, I absolutely feel that, and I'll just add one element to it, right? So I think constitutional protections are extremely important. They are well earned, right? They come out of sometimes, struggles of, civil liberty and democratic activists sort of making sure, right, that at each stage there's some kind of a safeguard on the acts of the state, right? Whether they are sort of habeas related or sort of more, everyday kind of safeguards. But I will say that, they have to then also take into account that there are many other, aspects in Indian law, right? That undermine the meaning of these constitutional safeguards, right? So, if you think about the presence of extraordinary laws, which are, until now always upheld by the Supreme Court, right? Whether it's Armed Forces Special Powers Act or, UAPA or, other or sedition laws, right? I mean, so I think there's also something at the very heart of the Constitution that and jurisprudence that has not emphasized the importance of liberty in exactly the same way, right? Particularly when it comes to defining somebody as, sort of challenging or dissenting against the state, right? And this is across different political regimes as well, even though one can say that under in our current phase, you see it in a much more visible way. So I do want to sort of add that, right? So we cannot think about constitutional safeguards in isolation from some of the other ways that they are undermined in different parts of India as well. So that's one, India and other contexts. So that's one. The other I would say is to recognize that, and I think there are many very interesting constitutional law scholars who are like Abhinav Sekhri and others who are writing about policing and confessions and so on, and I think it does raise a question about whether confessions should not be the mode, right? But in order for us to move towards that, one has to recognize that it requires almost a rethinking of how we think of policing and the criminal justice, right? There are very important debates on which I don't want to sort of revisit at this moment, since we don't have time to think about what is it that we think about police and prisons and the role that they play, right? Then there is that larger philosophical question that in the current context of US is in the context of abolition and things like that. That's one direction. The other direction is to kind of think about, okay, if not confessions, then what are some of the other possibilities? And I would say that I think when we are thinking about the Indian context, there are many other reasons, right? I mean, when you think about the case load, the delays in cases, there are so many other things that need to be thought about, right? Who gets targeted in policing and prisons, those also become very, very important. And I will say that if I think about the US context, there are some very important debates on plea bargains and what ends up happening when you don't have, a due process. And so I would be very wary of any quick solutions, but really, I feel like even the conversation on confessions in the Indian context has not been enough to really, warrant sort of thinking about, okay, what is it that replaces it?
I want to say one thing. I can see Mr. Raghavan here also. There is latest, if you go to the Indian Society Criminology portal, there is a judgment coming where they're talking about mitigating factors.
Mhm.
That has appealed me, where they're saying that if there are any sensitive cases, mitigating factors means that the psychologists, social workers, they will go and study the background of the individual who is committing crime, heinous
Right.
crime. Or,
Yeah.
like I'm a criminal psychologist, I will say that if he's a serial rapist, he is a pervert. Okay. But why the perversion has come? From which environment has he come? What is his psyche? What type of background he has been grown? Or, there are many occasions I have interviewed where children, because I was doing counseling in Kinswood camp for 14 years when Justice Lukur was there. There were many children who were sexually abused in their childhood, and they are hidden victims. There were many children who were asked by their fathers to bring liquor for them, and if they did not bring, they were beaten and thrown out.
Right.
They're all in their projects. Now, these children, when they grow up, definitely they will not have any empathy towards anybody. They will be more aggressive. And these things, this judgment that is coming forth, which is, people are raising questions on it, mitigating factors. That
Right.
means if you go and study the background of the person and you try to understand that why the person has committed crime, most probably death penalty or life imprisonment will not be given. He will be placed in the institution and given some rehabilitation programs. So,
Yes.
this is something which is a positive side. Another thing I want to share with you all, there is again a lot of discussion on this portal is coming over a person being given not death penalty because he has, raped and murdered a minor girl. So there's a saying that he is giving, something which is beyond POXO, because POXO is not that strict. But here, death penalty, they said, according to POXO, should be given to the accused because he has raped a minor and murdered.
Mhm.
But in this case, what happens is that here this judgment is 20 years imprisonment,
Mm.
not death penalty, 20 years. Now you imagine if the man or if the boy is 25, 20 years he's going to spend behind the prison. And if
Ma'am,
he's made to work
ma'am,
and
if
proper
you,
rehabilitation is given, I think,
Professor Sanyal, if you don't mind, we actually have run out of time and Professor
Okay.
Lokaneeta has another engagement. But
fine. I just have an optimistic view here. That's what I want to share.
thank you, ma'am. And I think it's your years of experience that has kept us going in this profession as well. So we're
Thank
so
you very
glad
much.
that you've been sharing your experience. And all that I could say, Jinee, is that from your book itself, I would like to quote that where you said that the transgressions can be seen from the disaggregated, decentered, multi-layered, plurisetal, and fluid nature of the state, which allows for the numerous unintended outcomes to be accommodated. I think that sentence itself beautifully encapsulates the entire discussion that we've had, the points that have been brought out. Yes, there are realities. Yes, there are difficulties, but as there's no way and no reason to look over or pass over the concept of justice. So thank you, Jinee, for being with us, but I would hand it over to Professor Vijay Raghavan to do the rest.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's my job to propose a formal vote of thanks as we have decided amongst ourselves. So first of all, my profuse thanks to Jinee for agreeing to do this talk with us. Actually, when Ruchi informed us that she was doing the book review, and we thought that this is a great opportunity of getting you here and doing like a book talk where you talk about the book, and then Ruchi, since she has also gone through the book in detail, she could ask a few important questions. So I think that purpose has been served today because both of you have taken this task of enlightening all of us about the issues that you have very rightly highlighted in your book as well as in all your past work. So thank you, Jinee, once again. And I just hope that we will be able to continue our conversations in future in some form or the other, hopefully in the physical space and not in this online mode that we have all got used to now, but are sick and tired of it now. The other thing, I would also like to, of course, thank the Indian Society of Criminology, the headquarters, as well as the Mumbai branch for having, created this space. The Mumbai branch was created many years back, but it was dormant for many years for various reasons. But now we have really kind of worked hard to make sure that we bring it alive again. And so this is the second talk that we have organized. As Asha said, that we had done another talk by retired Justice Thipse of the Bombay High Court on the role of social workers and probation officers in the justice system. And so this is the next one. We hope to do similar talks. Also, there are other members here from the Mumbai branch of the Indian Society of Criminology, some of whom are academics and who have also volunteered to organize similar lectures and talks from time to time. So we are hoping that they take the lead too, so that we have a more shared kind of responsibility of taking things forward, both in the student community as well as field people from the academics, even lay people, to create a kind of an environment where there is discussions around these issues, because these issues don't really get discussed otherwise. So the purpose of the society is to create kind of a, public criminology, as Ian Loder has written about. I'd like to thank our computer section for having organized and given us the link for the Zoom link for doing this session. And last but not the least, all the participants who have been here and have actively taken part, Madam Sanyal, other colleagues, some of whom have been our own students. Vinita has asked a lot of questions. She was a PhD student from TISS who has done her PhD on vocational training and work in prisons. So, these are people who are interested in this issue. I'd like to thank our students who have been part of this discussion, and I hope they have learned something from today's discussions. And lastly, probably thank all my colleagues on behalf of the Center for Criminology and Justice. If I've left out anybody, please excuse me. Thanks, Jinee. Thanks, Sanyal Madam, for being part of this session.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Maybe, Jinee, if you can just put down your email address on the chat box, then people who may be interested to get in touch with you on a one-to-one basis.
You had mentioned you had read an article of Sukanya Shanta from Wire. She's also one of our students, and she's listening to you at the moment.
Oh, okay.
She's here.
That's wonderful.
Sukanya's here. Yeah.
Congratulations on her award as well.
Yes, she's got a fellowship. Yeah.
She is there. She's attending lectures, and she's partly joined it here.
Nice. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you from my side also. It's very inspiring.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
And for me, it's always a step to learn. Thank you.
And it's always inspiring for us to keep learning from your optimism as well.
That is an inspiration for me. You are keeping me alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Okay. Thanks, Jinee. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.